And I'm very pleased to welcome Cori Fata-Hartley from the College of Natural Science and the Assistant Dean for Curriculum Coordination in CNS. I've known Cori for quite a while from our involvement in CERNL, and always a pleasure to watch Cori teaching, and she's such a good teacher they rewarded her by giving her administrative tasks. So we will, with that, allow you to get going.
All right, thanks, Mark. Okay, so thanks for coming, everybody. We have a nice crowd. Thank you for being here. Today I'm going to talk to you about this idea of moving forward using backward course design, alignment of learning outcomes, instructional activities, and assessments. I found this picture on the internet a while ago. It kind of looks like me when I was a kid, but it's not me. It is how I feel on most days, and what I want to argue today is that that's okay in this case because we are using backward design, so we want to start with the end in mind. So the workshop goals for today are twofold. These are general, broad goals, and what I want to highlight right now is that I'm going to try to use best practices. We're going to be talking about goals and objectives, learning goals and objectives for your courses. I want to try to model that here with what I'm doing by defining the workshop goals, and then we'll be talking about workshop objectives. So, two goals. Participants will understand that instructional design evolves backward from clear objectives and is aligned across all three stages of backward design. The second goal, participants will understand the value of articulating clear learning goals and objectives. And this one is, I think it's almost one of the most important things that I hope that you get out of this today. When I first was introduced to the idea of backward design and developing learning goals and objectives and articulating them for the students, it changed the way I thought about teaching. And that has continued to evolve over the years, but getting started there with goals and objectives I think is really critical. So, our objectives, by the end of this workshop, what I hope that you are able to do is to apply the principles of backwards design when you're considering refining your course or developing a new course. I hope that you would be able to evaluate alignment of learning objectives, instructional materials, and assessments. That's something that we'll talk about today. And then I hope that you will be able to develop learning objectives that blend big ideas and science practices. If anybody here has been to my workshops about backward design before, this is something new. It's a new piece, and I'm excited to talk about the idea of blending big ideas and science practices. A quick overview. I will give a very brief introduction to curricular design, what the definition of a curriculum is, the elements of curricular design, and the different approaches that folks use. Then we'll have an overview of backward design, addressing the situational factors, learning outcomes and objectives, feedback and assessment, and instructional activities. And then for the rest of the workshop, we'll talk about applying backward design to your course, and specifically we'll think about a teachable unit as a model for applying backward design. So what is a curricula? The Stark and Latuca is one of the sources that I've used in the development of these materials over the years, and they are specifically focused on college curricula. So I like their materials and I have found them very helpful. And they say, simply put, a curriculum is an academic plan to foster students' learning. So the elements of the curricula include learning outcomes or goals, the teaching and learning materials and activities, and assessments. And this is what is broadly considered to be the elements of curricula, not just from Stark and Latuca. The key point here is that having a defined curriculum facilitates learning. I also think it facilitates good teaching. So if we know what we're doing, if we have a plan for what we're doing, and it's aligned with in these three areas, then teaching is better. As a result, learning can be better. So this is just another graphical sort of representation of the elements of curricula, and I will be coming back to this figure repeatedly, but I again want to highlight the idea that we want to think about how these things are aligned. It's good to have these different elements, but really making sure that you have a quality curriculum is based on the alignment of these three elements. So how do we develop curricula? Common approach to course level curriculum development. This is how I started. I think that maybe some of you in the room have started this way, but we start by choosing, oh, why aren't the words showing up? Okay, we start in the first box, it should be choose text. Okay, I can see it on my side slide, interesting. Choose text. So we pick a text or we are given a text that we use for our course, perhaps from the department or from the other faculty in the department. We identify which chapters will be covered. Okay, we're going to cover in introductory biology, we're going to cover chapters 1 through 20 of the great big biology textbook. Then develop lectures. We've spent a lot of time over the years developing lectures, sitting down hours upon hours writing lectures. When I was a postdoc at the University of Wisconsin, I took a fellowship with Jo Handelsman, and she talked about how she spent 20 hours per lecture when she started teaching for the first time. I don't know if I spent quite that much, but it was up there. Making sure that I understood the material, going through all this content and creating these lectures. And then after we develop the lectures, in this box, oh, look it, we have create exams. I don't know why it did that. Okay, but, and that's how I taught the first time. I didn't start with my exams. I went through all those steps, and then I created exams, okay? And that, you know, usually finishing the night before or maybe the morning of. There are problems with this. And one of the biggest problems that we talk about in thinking about how to better teach our courses, particularly STEM courses, is content coverage. Instead of asking questions about what students are learning or what they are doing, I was asking questions about what chapters will be covered, how many pages will be covered, what do the students need to know, what do they need to recall. I had a vocabulary list that the students were learning, okay? And the other thing that Wiggins and McTeague, one of the models of curricular design I'll highlight in a moment, focuses on is hands-on, minds off. Being active for the sake of being active is not necessarily a good thing. It may keep the students awake a little bit longer, but if it's not explicitly connected to the learning objectives, it's not necessarily beneficial to the students. And what are the students doing? Are they doing things that we would want them to do as scientists and engineers? Or are they just, again, being active for the sake of being active? What our students should be asking, and what I've been asking myself over the last 10 years, is what's the point? What's the big idea? What does this, as students, help us to be able to do? Why should we learn this? And this still comes up with my students. I have packaging students in introductory cell and molecular biology. So I still get this question a lot. But what I try to do, and what I've tried to do over the years, is to help create a story that shows what I want the students to do and how the activities that we are asking them to do is aligned with getting to be able to do those things, okay? So instead of going, here's the textbook, here are the chapters that we're going to cover, there are lots of alternatives to traditional design. And these are scholarly approaches to curriculum development. There are people in educational research that focus on how do you develop curricula. I am certainly not one of those people. I have benefited from reading the work that these folks have done. And these are some really common models that are mentioned often. The one, Latuka and Stark from the University of Michigan, that one is shown here in the middle. Understanding by Design, Grant Wiggins and Jay McTeague, and D. Fink's Creating Significant Learning Experiences. D. Fink has been here a couple times to give talks through the Faculty and Organizational Development Office. And so this is just, I've tried to take aspects of all of those and incorporate that into our talk today. And one thing that all of them include is this idea of backward course design. the idea of beginning at the end. So I saw this in an essay about curriculum design, so I like to show it. It is a passage from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here? That depends a good deal on where you want to get to, said the cat. I don't much care where, said Alice. Then it doesn't matter which way you go, said the cat. I think that's how our students often feel. And I think what we want to do is give them the direction so it does matter which way they go, and so that they can get to where they need to go. I contend, and this is based on the work of many others, is that beginning with the end in mind by articulating learning outcomes or learning objectives facilitates inquiry in support of learning. And so what I want to do in the next couple minutes is set up what this looks like in terms of inquiry in support of student learning, and then I want to compare it to disciplinary research, because you're all disciplinary researchers, and that's the one thing we have in common across the STEM disciplines. So our first goal in this effort is to identify the desired results. What should students know, understand, be able to do? So what do you want them to be able to do by the time they have completed all the activities associated with the course? Next, we ask, what is acceptable evidence? So we know what they want them to do. How will we know whether or not they can do it? How will we know students achieved the desired results? What will be accepted as evidence of student understanding and proficiency? Then, once we have those two things in place, then we can start to plan the learning experiences. If this is what we want students to do, this is what we will accept as evidence. What do they need to be doing in order to be able to achieve those outcomes? What activities will equip students with the needed knowledge and skills? What materials and resources will be useful? Okay? Then we implement, collect, and interpret the data. What does the evidence tell us? Did the students actually learn what you wanted them to learn? Did they achieve the results? Did they develop the competencies that you hoped that they did? If they didn't, what can be done to change things? Are your learning outcomes the right ones? Are the assessments really getting at what you want to know about their learning? And if those two are in place, then maybe you can change the learning activities, the teaching and learning activities that the students participate in to help them better achieve those learning outcomes. Okay? So this process, it is in my mind a circular process because we're always going back, it's always iterative. I'm always changing my courses, but here it is linearly, and the idea is inquiry in support of learning. So this is very much like inquiry in support of disciplinary scholarship, which is not going to show up. Develop a hypothesis and thesis. All right, that's where we often start. Some folks are based on research where you're asking questions. That's another way to think about it. But identifying the desired results, we want to compare to developing a hypothesis or thesis. Then, in your research, after you have a hypothesis, you determine what will be acceptable evidence as to whether or not the hypothesis is supported or refuted. So just like we do in inquiry in support of learning, we're going to think, what is the evidence that would tell me that my hypothesis is refuted? Then you plan the research, plan the experiments, come up with the methods. Okay? So what methods are going to give us the evidence that's acceptable to help us refute or support our hypothesis? And then finally, this one is the same color because it's the same thing. We're going to implement, collect, and interpret the data. And in both cases, we want to go back and think about the data and what it means in the context of identifying the desired results or the hypothesis. Okay? So I'm arguing here that people in this room are scientists and engineers who think about things very critically. Often, we don't think about our own teaching in the same way. and we use anecdote, and we use our past experiences as evidence for what amounts to good teaching and what is best for our students. What we were arguing here today is that what we want to do is something that is much similar to our disciplinary scholarship, that we use evidence to make decisions about our teaching and learning. So I'm going to focus quite a bit on the DFINC model today, but again, I have pulled from these other pieces quite liberally. The biggest thing I'm going to pull from DFINC's work is his model, looking at how these things all align, the learning objectives, the feedback and assessment, the teaching activities, and the piece that DFINC adds that I really like are the situational factors. We don't teach in a vacuum, and we want to think about how those situational factors affect the teaching and learning experience. Some of the situational factors are not in our control, but others are. So let's take a look at the situational factors. Characteristics of the teacher. Not every method or pedagogical approach that is the hottest flavor right now is going to work for you. You have to think about what are the characteristics of you as the teacher before you plan teaching activities. You want not to do something just because someone else tells you to do it, but something that you can do, that you're comfortable with, and that will align with the rest of the course. Characteristics of the learners. Mark and I were just talking about my different teaching experiences while I've been here at MSU. I used to teach over in Lyman Briggs, where most of the students were biology majors in the introductory cell and molecular biology course that I taught. Now I teach in the College of Natural Science, basically the same course, but only 35% of them are even Nat Sci students, let alone biology students. So it's a much more diverse audience, and the characteristics of the learners are quite different. The nature of the subject, the activities, the objectives that you have are going to differ based on the nature of the subject. There's expectation of external groups. We think about this a lot for engineering in particular, where you have ABET to think about and those expectations of external groups. The specific context of the teaching and learning situation. So I want my classroom to be active. I want people to interact and do things. One of the challenges is that I teach in a room that has stadium seating and immovable seats. So I have to think about that challenge when I'm planning my courses. If we think about all these things, if we think about the characteristics of the student, we think about our own characteristics, what I hope that this gets folks to is inclusive teaching and learning. And I've given workshops just on that topic, so I won't talk about that anymore today. But we really do want to be aware of these issues as we're planning our curricula. So this is where we start with the end in mind, the learning and goals and objectives. So learning goals are statements of what the learner is to learn, what the learner will be able to do as a result of the learning process, the end result of the learning process. These are all sort of synonyms for the basic idea of what a learning goal is. Learning objectives, so let me just say that people use goals, objectives, outcomes a little bit interchangeably. This is the way I'm going to use it for this talk. Learning goals are these big statements of what the learner is to learn. The learning objectives are statements that describe what performance or behaviors will indicate accomplishment of the broader learning goals. Okay? So learning goals are about big ideas, disciplinary core concepts, disciplinary practices and competencies. Then when we write the learning objectives, they are a description of what the students are expected to do. They're specific and they're measurable. So a lot of times when we talk about our courses, we want to say things like, well, I want students to understand this. Yes, we do want students to understand this, but how do you measure understanding? It's very hard to measure whether or not someone understands something. So what we want to do is work on creating objectives that describe what the student is expected to do to demonstrate that understanding. Okay? So the purpose is to guide instructors through backward design, to help us see the forest for the trees, allow students to know what is expected of them. And more our students are expecting this as they go through the No Child Left Behind years. And now I've heard someone say that our last 2 cohorts of students are the first groups of students who have been through No Child Left Behind in their entire career. And there are certain outcomes that they're going to. We don't need to talk about the value or the merit of those particular outcomes, but they're used to knowing what is expected of them. And I would argue that we should tell our students what is expected of them, that they should know what they need to do in order to succeed in this course. Learning goals and objectives allow assessment of teaching and learning. So of course we want to assess our students in terms of learning. One of the ways we do this is by giving grades. But what do those grades actually mean in terms of whether or not the students are achieving the objectives? And then, based on whether or not they're achieving those objectives, how are we doing as teachers? How is our teaching facilitating that learning? So after we have the learning outcomes and objectives, we want to think about feedback and assessment. This idea of what will be evidence to tell us whether or not the students have achieved the objectives. A definition from Ann Austin, who is an education scholar here in the College of Education and is now doing a stint at NSF. I've pulled some of these from her materials. These are the methods that are used to determine whether and to what extent learners have achieved the learning outcomes. So again, we want to ask, what is the evidence that will be acceptable to answer that question? When we have that in place, then it's time to think about what teaching and learning activities will align with your goals and objectives and assessments. What you do in the classroom should give students practice so that they are able to do the assessments that you will use to measure whether or not they've achieved the learning objectives. We want all of this to be connected, okay? So if we think about what are the teaching and learning activities, these are the structure and sequence, activities and resources that help learners achieve the intended outcomes. If you don't know, if you don't articulate what the students are supposed to be learning, how do we know what they should be doing? So starting by articulating that makes this very different. It's not just writing a lecture. We're not just writing a lecture anymore. What we're doing is creating a set of activities that will help the students to be able to achieve the desired outcomes. Okay? And another key question we want to think about is, what does the research tell us about how people learn? When we design teaching and learning activities, what does the research tell us about how people learn? The research tells us that students do not learn by sitting passively listening to lecture. And so when we think about how to help the students achieve outcomes, research tells us that this doesn't work. And if they're sleeping, of course it doesn't work, right? So we want to think about which teaching and learning activities are aligned with evidence on education research that tell us will help our students learn. Okay, and then again, we want to make sure all of these are aligned. We can have a really great teaching activity, but if it's not aligned with the learning outcomes for the course, then it's really kind of meaningless. Maybe it belongs in another course, or maybe it belongs in a different unit. We want to make sure that what you're asking the students to do is aligned across the course. Okay, so we want to now take this and apply it, and I'll put you all to work as we go through this to think about how we could apply it to our own class. And one of the ways I learned how to do this was as a teachable unit. So when I was in Joe Handelsman Fellowship Program some 10 years ago now, what we did was create a teachable unit. So it's overwhelming to think about a whole class sometimes. So we can break it down into a unit, a week, even a lecture, and try to think about how we will define these components of the curriculum for that particular unit. So this is an example of one I've done. many times, and this has changed over the years in the presentations because I've changed what I've done in my class over the years. And I'm just putting it all up in front because I've been told that helps the participants. But we're going to go through this step by step, and you're going to get an opportunity to apply some of this. So I have my learning goal and objective. The big, broad idea that I want to talk about is I want my students to understand the molecular structure and function of cell membranes. So the really key component of understanding biology, and particularly molecular biology. I've got the word understand there. That's not measurable, right? It's not measurable. I can't tell if my students understand something unless I ask them to do something. What I'm asking them to do is draw a molecular level model of a phospholipid bilayer and use it to predict the ability of a given molecule to cross the membrane. Okay? And so then I have an exam question that's really very similar to the learning objective. I have a bunch of activities, including mini lectures, traditional type lectures, homework assignments, things like that. And then I'm always asking, and the reason I've refined this over the years is because I'm asking if it's aligned. I'm asking if the students are actually learning. Okay? So let's start with the learning goal and objective. Where do we really start here? Again, this can be a little bit overwhelming. And in past years, what I've talked to people about is using Bloom's taxonomy to create learning objectives. I'm not going to do that today. What I'm going to encourage folks to think about is creating learning objectives that blend big ideas and science practices. Okay? So big ideas and science practice to create a learning objective. What is a big idea? Big ideas are talked about in all of these models of curriculum development. This is what we want our students to learn. Big ideas have disciplinary significance, are generative, and have explanatory power. So this is from Wiggins and McTeague. I really like this quote. Big ideas are important and enduring. Big ideas are transferable beyond the scope of a particular unit. Big ideas are the building material of understanding. They can be thought of as meaningful patterns that enable one to connect the dots of otherwise fragmented knowledge. This is really key because what we know about learning is that students do not learn from fragmented knowledge. So thinking about what are the big ideas of the discipline, what should the students be trying to wrap around these littler ideas, the littler concepts and facts, having an umbrella or a framework for understanding those fragmented ideas will help them learn. Okay, so that's the first thing we want to think about. What are the big ideas in the discipline? The second thing, the idea of the practices, is what should students be able to do with these big ideas? A lot of times we stop at what are the big ideas, and that's good. But what do you want them to do with it? Our students are going to be scientists and engineers or healthcare professionals. What do you want them to be able to do with that knowledge? And we want to think about this in terms of science practices and engineering practices. That's what I would encourage you to do today. So what are the set of activities and approaches used to develop, extend, and refine scientific knowledge? And this definition is a little bit different for engineering practices, and I apologize that I didn't put one up for engineering practices, but they do have it. And this is from the NRC framework for STEM education. And it includes a whole section on some of these competencies as they relate to engineering. Okay, so these include scientific ways of thinking and the skills needed to engage in scientific inquiry. It's great if our students know this stuff, know these facts, but how are they going to actually use it and actually demonstrate that they've learned it? The NRC has defined a set of science practices. These may not be inclusive of what you do, but I think they're pretty representative of what we do generally speaking in science. We ask questions, we develop and use models, we carry out investigations, we analyze and interpret data, we use mathematics and computational thinking, we construct scientific explanations based on evidence and reasoning, and then there's scientific communication. So instead of saying, here's a list of verbs from Bloom's taxonomy, which is what I've done in the past, what I want you to try to think about today is how can we have the students engage in the material that we want them to know, using the practices that we want them to have by the time they graduate from this program. Because I think everyone would agree, we want our students to do more than know stuff. We want them to be able to do these kinds of things. In engineering, we want them to be able to design things. So just focusing on the big ideas isn't sufficient. I want to give out one handout where I have a list of big ideas that was developed for a course, this introductory molecular biology course, BioSci 161. It was a committee, it was a group of people who came to an understanding of what are the big ideas in the discipline and how is it defined within this course. So this is an example of the big ideas, and then on the back are the definitions for the science practices for, from the NRC. So if you want to pass those around, excuse me, that'll just be for a reference for the next thing that I'm going to have you do. So here's an example of big idea, science practice equals learning objective. And the big idea that I talked about in this example teaching unit is structure function, and you'll see that on this list. Structure function is really important to understand in biology. It's structure property in chemistry. There's lots of places that this is important. And the practice I've used is models, developing and using models. So I'm asking the students to draw a molecular level model of a phospholipid bilayer and use it to predict the ability of a molecule to go through. That's my learning objective, and I contend that it blends a big idea and a science practice. This is very different than what my learning objectives used to look like. I used to have a really, really long list of learning objectives, and my students appreciated it. But it was things like describe the structure of a cellular membrane. Now I have this much more complex mechanism for trying to get students to be able to describe the structure of a cellular membrane. So this, they need to know, in order to do this, they need to know how to describe the structure of a membrane to do that, right? So I would be hard-pressed to find someone who would say from an introductory cell and molecular biology course that you don't need to know this. You need to be able to do this. You need to be able to describe the structure of a cell membrane. But that doesn't tell me that my students actually understand it. They could just be describing the same thing that's in the book or describing words that I gave them in class. If I make them do this, I know they've got that, right? But I'm asking them to take a step further. And I can change the questions such that they're just not doing recall in the class. I can give different molecules. I can give different situations where they're having to predict the ability of things to travel through the membrane. They really need to understand the molecular components of the membrane in order to be able to answer that question. Okay, so that's how, where I wanted to juxtapose what I used to do with what I do now in terms of blending the science practices and the big ideas. And what we want to do now is to give you an opportunity to work on this and take a shot at developing some a learning goal and a couple learning objectives. So I'd encourage you to select a course that you teach and write one broad learning goal based on a big idea in your discipline, and then write 2 learning objectives, maybe using different practices that blend the big idea with one of these practices. And we can think about engineering practices as well, and while you're working, I could even find those and pull those up on the screen. Okay? And then after you've spent some time doing this, you can either work with someone while you're doing it, or at least at the end, after you've worked on it for a while, find someone to talk to and share what you've come up with. I'm happy to answer questions and walk around as you're working on this. So let's take a few minutes to give this a shot. Okay, so let's just come back together just for a moment before I send you on with your next task. The next thing I'd like you to do is apply a rubric to the learning objectives that you have written. And so I'll hand these out, and again, trying to model practice, model teaching practices. This is a way to evaluate your progress on developing learning objectives. And it identifies the criteria and the important components of writing good learning objectives. So what do we want? We want a learning objective that will describe what performance or behaviors indicate the accomplishment of the learning goals. Students know what is expected of them. And we have here in comprehensive a list of characteristics of a good learning objective. So it's clear what the students will know, understand, and be able to do. It's clear what specific behaviors and skills and performances demonstrate understanding. The objectives are aligned with the overall learning goal. So sometimes we have a big goal and the objective that we've written for it perhaps isn't really getting at that broader goal. The objectives are measurable. Can you have the student do the activity and measure how well they did it? Okay, to me that's a tough one. And then this added piece are the objectives blending a big idea and a science practice. Okay, and then intermediate and cursory levels of completion was when you're not quite there yet. Okay, so this is what we're aiming for. If you've never done this before, you're probably somewhere here, okay? If you're over here, you're probably just somewhere else in your head right now. So take a minute and go over your objectives and your neighbor's objectives and see where you land on this learning objective and see if it helps you see the key characteristics of a learning objective. So take a few minutes to do that. So let's do a little debrief and see what you came up with. So who would like to tell us, or first of all, do you have any questions about this process? Any questions about the idea of blending big ideas and science practices to create learning objectives? No? Okay. So who would like to offer something they came up with? I have long wait time, so. Yes?
It's easier to design an objective with a measurable outcome if you don't use multiple choice, but if you're using multiple choice exams, I think that makes it much more difficult. So I wonder do you have any suggestions?
Yes. That is, so if you didn't hear, it's a lot easier to write a open-ended exam question or an open-ended assessment that gets at a measurable outcome. It's much harder to write a multiple choice one. And that is absolutely true. We have a whole project that is focused on that, the AAU STEM initiative, and we're working to create a tool to help people write multiple choice questions that have some practice in them. It's not the same, right? It's not the same as if I ask a student to draw. But what we're trying to do is create sort of an algorithm for writing questions that infuse these science practices and what that looks like for multiple choice. I wasn't prepared to share that today. I have part of that, but not really the multiple choice part of it. But I could certainly put you in touch with some of those resources after this. Before we get to the assessments and the multiple choice, you want to first start by thinking about what are the learning objectives? What are the learning, what do you want the students to be able to do? And while we want to try to have assessments that align with that, informative and summative assessments that do that, sometimes we won't be able to give students feedback on it because of the situational factors in our classes. I have 250 students in my class, so I teach a large class as well. I don't get feedback on all the or give students feedback on all the learning objectives that I have for them because I can't. I still ask them to do the work. I just don't have the ability to give assessment feedback on everything I ask them to do. So it's not, as we have these large class sizes, we will never get to the ideal situation for how assessment will happen, but that is a situational factor that we have to work with. Was there something here?
Yeah, it's, I think there's something here that's implicit but not explicit, and that's what I'm struggling with, and it sort of ties back into this, and that is, what is the role of acquisition of fundamental knowledge in this framework? Because the sort of scientific practices that you listed in this Rubric don't include that. Right, but it's implied. So I can look at when there's like thermodynamically favorable reactions or coupled to et cetera, et cetera. There's an implication there, and that is that you know the laws of thermodynamics. Right? And it seems like foundational knowledge is a critical aspect of basic scientific forces, and I'm sort of wondering how that works into a linkage between the big idea and scientific practice when it's really foundational just to the big idea.
Right, so the list I've given you here is a statement of the big ideas, and it doesn't go step by step and list the foundational knowledge that you need to have in order to understand the big idea. You're right, it is implicit, it is not explicit in the way it is presented here. What the group has been doing that is reforming this course based on big ideas is this is our starting point. And now we're going through and developing learning objectives that we think demonstrate that students have a conceptual understanding of these big ideas, and that includes focusing on foundational knowledge. So we don't want to neglect foundational knowledge. You can't get to a conceptual understanding of these types of concepts without foundational knowledge. But it is not explicit in what I've shared with you. It is explicit in the process that we're going through as we continue to reform this course. Does that address your concern at all? Okay. Other thoughts, comments, questions? Okay, who would like to share a learning objective? I have to get feedback about how I'm teaching to see if you've been able to achieve any of the learning objectives. Thank you.
So I'm actually a graduate student, so I've never actually formally taught the course. I'm a TA for BS 161 this semester, and one of the things that my PI is allowing me to do, since I'm involved in the teaching certification program here at MSU, is actually give a part of the last lecture which deals with evolution and an introduction to evolution. So feel free to butcher these as much as you want. This is my first time going at it. So the learning goal that I came up with is that understanding that evolution is driven by many processes and understanding these processes. So obviously a really big idea. And because I'm an MMG graduate student, one of the things that I really like are microbes. So I want to use microbes and antibiotic resistance to kind of model what is going on. And so for the learning objective, I came up with model how mutations and natural selection affect bacterial populations and how this can lead to a new evolved bacterial population that has acquired resistance.
Great, great. I think that's fantastic. Is there anyone that thinks that students shouldn't know that when they leave MSU as an MMG student or some other, or even a non-science student? Wouldn't that be great if all our students knew that when they left? And so it's really not just repeating or defining things, it's creating a model that shows how all these interconnected facts are related, right? So they would really have to understand some basic foundational knowledge in order to be able to do that well, right? Not everybody's going to be able to do that well, but in order to be able to do that well, if they have achieved the objective, they will have to demonstrate a lot of that foundational knowledge, but they're also getting practice at creating and using models. And that is another thing that I think a lot of us think students should be able to do when they leave here, is to be able to create and use models. Great, thank you for sharing. Would someone else like to share something? Can't just have one. That's not a trend, right? Anyone? Something halfway there? Yes.
So I teach genetics, and one of the biggest goals is to understand the connection between genes and traits, or genotypes and phenotypes. And so you could have particular objectives that they have. So like describe the approach, if you have a human genetic disease, describe an approach to figure out the genetic basis of that genetic disease.
Okay.
Or you could describe, here's the mutation that occurs in this gene and describe how that might affect the phenotype.
Okay. Okay. So in the latter one, they would have to make some predictions about a phenomenon. So based on the information you give them, they have to make some predictions about what is happening, rather than just saying things like, our students are really good at telling you that you go from DNA to RNA to protein. They're really good at reciting that, but we have lots of research to show that they don't really understand that. So asking them to make predictions is aligned with science practices and is aligned with what we want students to be able to do as scientists and science students. So that would also get at the content piece, big idea, and practice. Okay, Sue, did you have one too?
Well, I will venture, Rosa and I have both right now, and literally worked in comparative anatomy and biological vertebrates together. And part of the course is very amenable to this, and then I have real issues with trying to think of another part. And the overall big goal is for students to see the relationships between all of the chordates, not just the vertebrates, all of the chordates.
Okay.
To see structurally how they are similar, how different organs function in different animals, and in an evolutionary sense, how they are all related. So the evolutionary part is a little bit easier, I think, to cope with. The objective is to, I don't want to use the word understand, but to be able to plug animals into an evolutionary model. And that's testable because you can ask them to construct playgrounds. And it can be with a group of animals that are not directly the ones that they have worked with in the playground. They can make their own, or you can give them a branch and have them put critters on a branch. And you can do that as multiple choice, because I've done that. Much harder is when one is dealing with a unit like we spent 5 minutes talking about circulation. Now, we have backup because their activity is very related to the objective of being able to utilize information about circulatory systems in a variety of animals. They have a lab. So I tell them about circulation in lecture. They dissect animals, etc. I don't know in a lecture what kind of questions to pose to them from a backward point of view, because I don't really care whether they can come up with some theoretical new design. That's not what happened evolutionarily.
Right.
So perhaps you can.
So let me open that to the group. What do you think? So that basically, do I understand it that right now they have to learn a lot of different systems?
Yeah.
Okay. And so
and understand them, not try not to just do a fact by fact thing. See how they all function together.
Okay. So what does the group, let me open this to the group, does the group have some ideas for how this could be infused with science practice to get at real understanding? The goal is to have them really understand how they're related, similarities that they have, things like that. What could they do to demonstrate that they really understand this?
Well, one thing that we can do is, in a lab, is to bring in an animal that is not the one that they have done all of the section, and have them, however we want, examine them using that model, or give them experience using it without giving them assistance. To some extent, I must say, we do that when they are doing their dissections. There are some animals where they are supposed to identify parts of a skeleton based on what they've done on other skeletons, and we don't give them the word list at the beginning for the identification. They get that after they've already had a go at it. Okay. Except they don't really take that seriously. They wait until they have the answers. So
well, we can't control for that yet, but yeah.
If I were doing this properly, then they would do it.
Right. Okay, so let me open it up to the group. Does anyone have ideas on how we could engage students? And then here.
Maybe something about, how different organisms solve the objectives of this is a circulatory system. How they solve the same problem but have different body plans or different circulatory systems in terrestrial versus, aquatic.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Yeah.
So you pose it as a problem for them to solve, that this is a challenge for circulation in this organism. How can you create a model or draw a diagram that shows how they solve it?
Yeah, something like that. And then if I guess you're talking about the evolutionary part, because there's sometimes canalization, then it's kind of like, why do they do it this weird way? If you wanted to bring them apart, that's kind of like, well, it was that way because it evolved from this route. It might not be the most efficient way, or
That's pretty hard when you ask me why evolution.
right? Yeah. Or how? Well, that's it. Yeah.
I was thinking similar along those lines, that if you dealt with fundamental physical forces that constrain circulation, pressure, gravity, those types of things, and if you dealt with scale dependencies in those things, you can ask questions like, what would happen to a human circulatory system if you made a human 14?
Except in a very basic level. That's difficult because we can't count on our students having read physics. We can't. They will when they graduate. Can't count on physics, can't count on math, can't count on chemistry.
Right.
Can you compare to other systems that are not animals, like a river or something like that, and just like how that evolves with time, for instance, to see that the model is applicable to other things? Like I feel like
I'm not quite sure where that would go, but I understand the river. Certainly, circulatory system is very likely.
it's to explain like evolution and like it applies to multiple bodies. I don't know because I'm not familiar with that.
So really you're asking the students to create a model that can help them understand these systems using something that they're familiar with, potentially. Yeah. So this is not easy, and we do have all these situational factors, like they haven't had physics yet. And so that really is a challenge that we have to overcome in our teaching. But I would argue that if to think about setting the bar higher than we typically do, that not just expecting our students just to know the stuff, but to create these models, to try to build on them. They won't all be able to do it, but I think it's really, we want to have high expectations for our students and really push towards getting them to be able to do these things in a more meaningful way that doesn't involve just reciting the material. So I think that's some great ideas from the group. I think we will, I'll take one more if someone wants to offer that would like, because that was productive in getting ideas for Sue and Rosa. Anyone else have one they want to share? Why are you all so shy? You're faculty, for crying out loud.
I also teach a genetics class. It's plant genetics, and it's an audience, students that are very interested in applied things, agronomists, turfgrass management, etc. So anyway, I like the idea of what if you change something, the change, in a system, right? Okay, like mitosis or meiosis, I guess. What would happen if you changed a specific thing about a chromosome? What would happen if? Under there's an infinite number of scenarios that you could use, and that they have to know the whole process to actually articulate a response to that.
Right, good. So what would happen if you added this drug, or this protein was broken and had a defect? I really like drug questions because you can have lots of different drugs, and you can even make drugs up for doing different things. But then, as you said, the students have to know the whole process in order to really get at the answer. So they're doing the kinds of things that we do as scientists. They're making predictions about what would happen based on an understanding of a current model. So that is very different than having them memorize the steps in mitosis, which they really like to do. They like to draw those pretty pictures. They like to show you where the chromosomes are and how they line up at the center line. They're very good at that. They learned how to do it in high school. But we want them to take a step further and make sure that they really understand what that process means. Okay, so the idea of doing this is a way to establish curricular priorities. And this comes from the Wiggins and McTeague model. If you go through your course, or if you're developing a new course and you do this and you really ask, what are the big ideas I want my students to know? What science practices or engineering practices do I want them to have? This allows you to say, okay, these are the things I want for enduring understanding. These are the things important to know and be able to do. And part of that could be some of this foundational knowledge that helps us have enduring understanding of big ideas. And then there's other things that are worth being familiar with. And we may still want to include those. But there's probably a whole bunch of things, and this has been my personal experience over the years, that really don't help students create an enduring understanding of big ideas or enduring ability for science practices or engineering practices. I think a lot of us have, and I know I have included a lot of details over the years. The thing is, they don't remember them. Because the way we teach in fragments and pieces and fragmented knowledge, the students aren't learning these ideas. So if we focus on making sure that they understand what a system is, if they understand what a model is, and they can apply that understanding to different models, to different systems, that is going to stick with them longer than knowing a lot of individual facts. And they may be able to do well on your multiple choice exam, remembering that. But in terms of real learning, this is not how human beings really learn. Okay, so we can think about what are the curricular priorities for the course. Wiggins and McTeague put it in the framework of knowledge, skills, behaviors, attitudes. We can think about it in terms simply big ideas in science and engineering practices. Okay, so then I think the even more challenging part becomes, as has already been alluded to, how do you get feedback and assessment for these learning objectives once you've established them? What will be considered acceptable evidence of their ability to achieve the goals? So this, again, is a written exam question that can be used. And it makes it easier because it's aligned with the learning objective, basically. And I am, quite frankly, quite happy to give this as a learning objective and this as an exam question. I don't care if that's teaching to the test. If my students can truly do this, and I can pick which molecule I'm going to add for the exam, and they can really explain different molecules, then I think I've done part of what I'm supposed to do for the course. So some people will argue that this is teaching to the test. I think that I can give this to students and there's still plenty who do really badly. So I'm okay with it. I'm okay with that. And that's one piece of this. But then the next piece goes to how do you write these assessments that blend big ideas and science practices. So the other thing I want to share with you is operational definitions that the AAU group project has developed to start to get at what is in an exam question that has a science practice in it. So these are mostly, right now this version is what we focus on for written ones. And again, I can share with folks, if you want to contact me, what we have right now for multiple choice at a later date. There you go. Okay, but this sort of breaks down these practices and says a question will represent a practice if it has these components in it. Okay, so what I'd like you to encourage you to do over the next couple minutes is to take one of those learning objectives that you have written and develop an assessment that blends that includes a science practice in it. So take a look at one of these science practices or a couple of them and see if you can come up with a question, an in-class problem, a homework question, a quiz question or an exam question that would really get at the learning objective. Okay? So take a few minutes to work on that. Feel free to work with others, but at least After you've worked on it for a while, share what you come up with those around you. And if you have questions or concerns, I can roam around and see where you're at. All right, let's see if anybody's willing to share something. This has been a slightly reluctant group, so we're all among friends here, so let's give it a shot. Who would like to share an assessment idea they came up with? Oh, come on. I saw everybody writing. Not even on the computers, but writing. Were you writing notes to each other? Yes, thank you. Okay, great.
So, this is our remedial math class, 1825,
Okay.
which I'm hoping to improve.
Okay.
And one of the units that I'm talking about is linear functions.
Okay.
So the big idea is to understand and interpret linear graphs, equations, and data tables.
Boy, it'd be great for students.
It would be, wouldn't it? Even in Calc 2.
Yes.
So the objective is, given a situation, create a data table, graph, and equation that describes the pattern.
Okay.
And then a second objective is identify the key components, namely slope and y-intercept, and explain their meaning in the context of the situation.
Okay.
Okay, so the assessment question. Joe planted a white pine seedling that was 2 feet tall. Under typical conditions, it's expected to grow 1.5 feet each year. Create a data table, graph, and equation that describes the situation. Use it to predict the height after 23 years. How many years will it take for it to reach a certain height? And then how would your equation change if the seedling was 3.5 feet tall when planted? Or if instead he planted a maple seedling, which is expected to grow at a rate of 0.8 feet a year.
That's great, right? I mean, that really hits all the bullet points for several of those, right? But using data or mathematical or computational thinking, it asks students to not just recognize things, but actually use it to make predictions, and then there's novel situations in there. So what if you have a different kind of tree that grows at a different rate? That's fantastic. Can you envision using that in your class?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so there's enough grading support to be able to do that? Would they would get feedback?
Yeah, we have enough TAs that we don't have to use multiple choice.
Okay, okay, that's great, that's great. I can envision biologically related, I mean it's a tree, so I guess it's biology, but very similar questions. I think a lot of the biologists I've worked with would like students to be able to do that. That's great. Other examples? Maybe not so well developed examples that you want to get some feedback on. See, this is when active learning doesn't work, when your students don't participate. So thank you.
I'll go ahead and share mine. So I'm not sure if this would be an exam question or like a follow-up if they actually did the model in class. But what I have is Laura had strep throat and got antibiotics. Describe what would happen to a bacterial population and describe the processes and how these processes would impact the evolution of this bacterial population, and compare and contrast these bacterial populations before and after antibiotic treatment.
Okay, great. So there's a lot in there, right? There's a lot, and so I would envision that being almost like a summative assessment at the end of the unit, right? And that might be a whole page of an exam. And it is a little daunting when you hear all those things, but you can write them, you can break them down into components, and that's really the easiest way to do that, to have 2-point chunks and things like that. If we ask our students to do that, you won't probably get what you want. So providing guidance and scaffolding within the question will help get at those different pieces. But again, they're trying to make predictions about what's going to happen based on a situation, and providing some evidence and reasoning to go along with it. What is the evidence that you're going to use? And then with that evidence, how do you reason about what is going to happen and why it's going to happen? Good. Okay, how about something else? One more.
I hear you, but it might be a bit complicated. So I teach a course on stream ecology, and one unit in the class is understanding how stream channels form, comes into being. So the goal that I wrote was understand the physical forces that shape stream channels and regulate particle transport. And then the objectives, I wrote 3 objectives in there, describe a set of physical forces and landscape features that regulate stream geomorphology, be able to predict channel form from a given set of forces and features, and be able to predict changes in particle transport as a consequence of altered channel morphology. Right? But the question I wrote is one that I think often has problems. So I can give them a topography, right? Like changing from a mountain slope to a flat plane, and give them what the overhead view of the channel is here and ask them to predict what the channel would look like with this change in topography and how that relates to the sets of forces that regulate particle transport and that kind of stuff. But the risk in my mind to a question like this is it builds a contingent into it, right? Okay. Unlike the previous example, if you get the first part wrong, you will get the second part wrong. Okay. Right? And that's a contingency that I try to avoid when questions, because with the first example, you could factually make the wrong prediction, but reasonably make the right next step to outcome. Yes. Right? So you can be wrong in the first part and right in the second part. But you could have questions like this where you get wrong in the beginning, you're going to be wrong throughout.
Right. Yeah. So would there be, I mean, it's a great question because it's using data, right? It's using examples from what you would really do as a field ecologist, right? And asking the students to do something with that. Would you be able to break it down into 2 different questions? So in other words, ask the first part in one question with a set of circumstances. And then because the second part is dependent on the first part, can you ask a second question in which you give them the first part and then they have to answer the second part? Would that give away the first one?
That's the trick, right? You got to do it in such a way that you don't, in question 7, you don't have the answer to question 2.
Right, yeah. No, this
I've fallen prey to that.
This is, it's a situational factor that keeps coming up in our AAU project too. Because one of the things we're trying to do to overcome this challenge of multiple choice questions is write nested sets of questions that if taken together would address one of these science practices that would satisfy all these criteria that are listed. But if you don't get the first part right, then you automatically miss the second and third. So we're trying to figure out ways to make it such that you ask about the first thing one way, and then you ask about the second thing in a somewhat unrelated question. But yeah, that it is. I can't help you because I've got students pissed off at me because I don't ask the choice. Yeah, okay. So you could potentially do it as a written one, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say for Michael or others that I mean, I guess if they get the answer for the first one, via the second question, like during the exam or the homework, I think that's okay, as long as if the way you ask the first one, you ask them to explain it somehow. I don't know, just so that because the point is that they're learning, right? And if they get it eventually, I mean, it might be okay.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've done with the AAU project is added that explanation piece in many cases. A lot of multiple choice questions, if the students are doing what you think they're doing, they probably do understand it if they get it right because they're creating the model, they're doing whatever you need to do. But a lot of times they're not, and they're guessing or they're using very strange reasoning that doesn't make sense. So if you somehow add a clause or in written exams, make sure that they have to explain it and not just give a right answer, then you're really getting at the learning a little bit more than you would otherwise. So I appreciate that point. Yeah.
This is just kind of a comment about that because in a totally different course, back in Intro Bio-Sci, I was asking students about Mendelian genetics kinds of things, and they knew what the parental units were, and they would predict the F2s. Mm-hmm. So you can just ask them to do that. But if you want to figure out using multiple choice how to do that as and give them partial credit for getting part of the way through, then you have to ask them about the gametes and the F1s and the gametes. And I had students quite annoyed because they didn't get the first one right, then they missed the rest. But the other way of thinking about that is to think of it as a different block of questions, and what you were doing is giving them
partial credit for as far along as they can get, what you would do if they had written out the wrong.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. If you had it as a written exam.
Yeah, and you give the partial credit the way you would on a math question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. Would you?
No, I was just going to say, what if you give them an intermediate answer that does not match the answer that you should get if you do the problem correctly, and then that's a starting point for the new problem, so that then you can give them the due credit if they do the second part of the problem correctly. There might be an alternative to that. Sure.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Okay, any other comments or thoughts? Complaints? Concerns? I've heard some before, so I'm open to them. It's not easy. It's not. It's this is, as I said, I've been basically teaching the same course for 10 years, and I'm not even close to being happy with it. I change it every year. I change my learning objectives every year. I change my teaching activities and assessments every year. So once we have I'm just going to be a few more minutes to wrap this up. Once we have the assessments and the learning objectives in place, one of the things that I've heard from workshops like this before, where this is new to people, is that, okay, if I'm going to write objectives like this and create assessments like that to go along with those objectives, what I do in the class has to change. Because what I'm doing in the class is not preparing the students to be able to do what I want them to be able to do. So if I want them to draw models, I can't stand up there and draw models the whole time. That is not going to, maybe in the beginning when they want to know what a model is and we're starting this process. But think back to when you learned this stuff. When I think back to taking parasitology, how many ever years ago, I didn't learn it by the teacher going over the cycle, right? I learned it by drawing it myself over and over again. And that was basic memorization. If we really want students to be able to use this knowledge in a meaningful way, we have to give them opportunities to do that. Standing up and lecturing in front of them does not give them opportunities to do that. Now, you can create a classroom where there's enough work outside of the classroom that they get those opportunities. But if the only thing that's happening in your class is lectures and exams, the students don't have the chance to really engage in the material in a meaningful way. Some of them will. You did. That's why you're here, right? That you figured out how to learn this stuff on your own. You studied and learned a different way than a lot of our students do. What our students often need are activities and materials and resources and direction for how to engage in this material in a meaningful way. And again, that's hard. I struggle with that constantly. And just like here today, if the students don't do the work, they're not going to learn it. Okay? A lot of this is time on task. But what I would encourage you to think about is, what is the task that you're giving the students to spend that time? Because if all they're doing is re-listening to the notes or re-examining notes, looking at PowerPoints and reading, for most students that is not going to help them learn in a meaningful way. And that's based on research about how people learn. Okay? So what we did, what people who are now PhDs and have been research professors for many years, that's not probably how we learned. We figured it out, right? Or else you wouldn't have a PhD. But not all of our students are going on to get PhDs. We have 50,000 students here. They're not all going on to get PhDs. So we have to try to create activities that will engage them in a meaningful way. And again, I have that up here one more time. This is not how human beings learn. It's not a hard sell to get science and engineering folks to agree that laboratory and design classes are great. They immerse students in science and engineering practices. What I would like you to think about is, how can you replicate that? Not replicate it, that's not the right word, but how can you create a similar atmosphere within your classrooms, within your lecture classrooms, where students are doing stuff with the knowledge and concepts and content that you want them to learn? so that we don't do that. Okay, and then again, we always want to bring it back to alignment. Are all these things aligned? Are what you're asking the students to be able to do they have the opportunities to practice doing that? Do they get feedback about whether or not they can do that through the teaching and learning activities? So that's all I had. Again, these are the workshop objectives that I had for you. So hopefully you have, if you weren't familiar already, have a better understanding of backward design and how to think about how these things are part of curricula, either in your own classes or in looking at examples from others. And then really think about how you might develop learning objectives that blend big ideas and science practices to engage students in a meaningful way. Thanks for your attention.